The Togolese opposition receives support from African civil society. As the government's draft bill on constitutional reforms demanded by the opposition is being reviewed, 8 civil society organizations have just signed a joint statement to support the struggle of this segment of the Togolese political class, which is also calling for the departure of President Faure Gnassingbé, who has been in power since 2005. Among them are well-known movements such as Balai Citoyen from Burkina Faso, Yen Amare from Senegal, Iyina from Chad, and Lucha from the Democratic Republic of Congo, who believe that the mobilization of the Togolese opposition against the government in recent weeks is part of a broad movement sweeping across all the peoples of Africa. Some leaders of these organizations are therefore calling on the international community, and especially the community of West African states, to support the democratic aspirations of the Togolese people in order to prevent a repeat of the scenarios seen in other crises on the continent. Most of the country's opposition parties have been demanding constitutional reforms for more than 10 years, aiming to limit the number of presidential terms to 2 and to introduce a 2-round voting system. It was still dark when the first armored trucks rolled through the empty boulevards of Lomé. Streetlights flickered, civilians remained asleep, but history had already woken up. At 4:12 a.m., soldiers in black tactical gear, faces masked, surrounded the presidential palace of Togo. They moved fast, no warning, no announcement. By the time the first guards realized what was happening, the gates were already breached. This wasn't a drill, this was the end. Inside, President Faure Gnassingbé, ruler of Togo for nearly 2 decades, stood alone in his office, confused, barefoot, holding his phone, but hearing no dial tone. "We've been compromised," a panicked voice had whispered minutes earlier through his encrypted line. "The military, they're not loyal anymore. They're coming." He had laughed until he heard the gunfire, until he saw his own elite bodyguards turning their rifles away from the gates and toward him. The arrest. The blast that shattered the palace doors was heard 3 blocks away. By the time cameras arrived, the drama had already unfolded inside. Soldiers, once handpicked by Faure himself, dragged him through the marble corridors, his tie loose, his face pale, his reputation in pieces. One soldier whispered coldly in his ear, "Your time is up. Togo chose freedom." The world watches. In an unprecedented moment, a live video was leaked. It showed Faure, barefoot, hands behind his back, being led down the steps of his palace in silence. No media team, no motorcade, just the sound of boots, the rustling of flags, and the roar of freedom building outside. By 6 a.m., the footage had reached every screen in Togo. By 7 a.m., it was trending globally. Faure falls. Togo rises, the streets erupt. Thousands poured into the streets of Lomé. Some weeping, some shouting, some falling to their knees in disbelief. Is it real? Is he gone? Did we finally win? Women beat drums. Young men hoisted signs that had been hidden for years. No more dynasties. Africa is not a kingdom. Togo is ours now. And in the middle of the chaos stood a boy, no older than 10, holding a homemade flag with one word written in charcoal. Free. Togo had awoken. But the world was only just beginning to understand what this moment meant. This wasn't just the fall of a man. It was the collapse of an era. To understand the storm that shattered the palace, you have to go back over 5 decades. Togo didn't fall overnight. It had been held hostage by one family name since 1967, Gnassingbé. First, there was Gnassingbé Eyadema, the soldier who seized power with a coup and never let go. For 38 years, he ruled with an iron fist. Elections were a ritual, not a choice. Dissenters vanished. The press was muzzled. Fear was a policy. And when he finally died in 2005, his son, Faure Gnassingbé, inherited the presidency like it was a family business. From father to son, Faure's rise was swift, suspicious, and staged. Within hours of his father's death, the military declared continuity of governance. They didn't ask the people. They told them. You had Eyadema, now you have his son. Togo watched in silence, because every voice raised against the dynasty was met with tear gas, exile, or worse. The promise that broke Faure came in with polished French, Western education and soft smiles. He spoke of reform. He spoke of modernizing Togo. But the more he smiled, the more the chains tightened. Promises of free elections, broken, constitutional reform, blocked, presidential term limits, overridden. Behind closed doors, foreign advisors cheered him on, as long as the contracts kept flowing and France's influence remained untouched. In public, Faure was the moderate face of West Africa. In private, he was building a fortress of fear. The youth could see through it, but there was one thing Faure didn't understand. The generation born after 1990 wasn't like their parents. These youth watched Thomas Sankara's speeches on smartphones, read Pan-African manifestos on Instagram, shared Coup news from Mali and Burkina on WhatsApp, dreamed of leaders who didn't inherit thrones. They were not afraid. They were awake. And when Captain Ibrahim Traoré rose in Burkina Faso, when Assimi Goïta stood firm in Mali, Togo's youth asked themselves, if they did it, why not us? The Silent Pact. It began as a whisper in the barracks, a glance between commanders, an encrypted message here, a shared frustration there, a silent alliance formed among young Togolese officers, the ones who had trained abroad, seen democracy work elsewhere, and returned disgusted by what they were guarding. They didn't hate Faure, they just refused to serve a lie any longer. Togo had been asleep, but its awakening had begun, and soon the man on the throne would face the one thing he feared most, his own people, standing tall. For years, Colonel Kwame Agbeome stood behind Faure Gnassingbé, stoic, loyal, unshakable. He wasn't just Faure's bodyguard, he was his shadow. He protected the president's secrets. He knew which ministers were stealing. He saw which opposition leaders were silenced. He walked the palace halls at night, hearing whispers no one else could, and for years he stayed silent. But something broke. A personal line crossed. One night, long after midnight, Colonel Agbeome received an envelope. No return address, no markings. Inside were photographs. A village burned, women crying, a toddler bleeding, a young man, the colonel's cousin, face down in the dirt, executed by soldiers, Togolese soldiers. The mission had been counter-insurgency, but in truth, it was punishment for a region that dared protest Faure's rule. That's when the colonel realized he wasn't protecting a president anymore. He was protecting a regime that devoured its own people. The secret network forms. Over the next 6 months, Colonel Agbeome began building an invisible alliance. Not rebels, not mercenaries, Togolese patriots in uniform, captains, lieutenants, intel officers, all young, all furious, all quiet. They met in coded chats. They shared maps, schedules, palace blueprints. They called it Operation Minuet. Midnight. The turning point. The final trigger came on a stormy September night. Faure ordered the arrest of a schoolteacher in Sokode for posting a poem online. Your crown is made of ash, and the wind is coming. Colonel Agbeome asked him, is a poem really a threat? Faure stared at him coldly and replied, fear is more useful than respect. That was it. That night, Agbeome whispered into a secure channel. It's time. Countdown to the coup day 7. Officers quietly switched guard rotations. Day 4. Surveillance cameras in key palace zones mysteriously stopped recording. Day 2. One final message was sent to allies in Burkina Faso and Mali. Stand by. The old lion is about to fall. And on day 0, as the city of Lomé slept, Colonel Agbeome unlocked the inner palace doors and let justice walk in. He wasn't a traitor. He was a liberator wearing the uniform of betrayal. It began with a whisper. A student in Kara refused to stand for the national anthem. A teacher in Atakpame read a banned poem aloud in her class. A market woman in Lomé tore down a presidential banner and shouted to the crowd, "They don't feed us. Why should we fear them?" These were small acts, but in a country ruled by silence, even whispers can become thunder. And that night, the thunder came. Just after sunset, across cities and villages, something unexpected happened. The people stood up. No leaders, No opposition party, just the people, angry, tired, brave. In Lomé, thousands marched down Rue de l'Indépendance, holding homemade signs. No more kings. Power belongs to the people. Togo is not for sale. Soldiers were stationed to block them, but some dropped their weapons, others turned and joined. By 9 p.m., the city was on fire, burning not from chaos, but from rebirth. Bonfires lit in front of government buildings. Crowds singing revolutionary songs not heard since 1963. Flags waved high, not for a president, but for a people reclaiming their voice. In Sokodé, young men surrounded a police station and demanded the release of detained protesters. When the commander refused, they formed a human wall, chanting, "Try to shoot us all. We are Togo." In Kara, Faure Gnassingbé's hometown, where fear had always ruled, something unimaginable happened. The statue of his father, Gnassingbé Ayadama, was pulled down by the hands of former soldiers. And as it crashed to the ground, the crowd went silent. Then someone whispered, "It's over," and the crowd exploded into tears. No one gave an order. No one needed to. It was no longer a protest. It was an awakening. Women banged on pots. Motorcyclists drove in circles, honking in celebration. Even street vendors gave out food for free. It was joy mixed with rage. Pain turned into power. For the first time in decades, the streets of Togo didn't belong to fear. They belonged to the people. And as the night sky burned with fire and freedom, one message echoed across the nation. The dynasty has fallen. Now we rise. As dawn broke over Togo, the world finally took notice. International headlines raced to catch up. Military seizes power in Togo. End of the Gnassingbé dynasty. Revolution erupts in West Africa. But while the people danced in the streets of Lomé, the world's most powerful nations went quiet. In Paris, French officials scrambled behind closed doors. Faure Gnassingbé had been a reliable friend, one who signed contracts without complaint, kept the region stable for investors, and never questioned old colonial ties. Now he was in chains, and the people he once ruled were tearing down everything he stood for. The French presidency issued a short, cold statement. "We are monitoring the situation in Togo. We encourage a return to constitutional order." Not a word about the repression, the stolen elections, the silenced voices. Just an elegant demand to return to the status quo. In Washington, the US State Department waited 6 hours before speaking. Their tone was cautious, calculated. "We urge all sides to remain calm and respect democratic institutions." But to the people of Togo, it sounded like betrayal. Because what democratic institutions? Faure had changed the constitution twice to stay in power. Where were those voices when his regime jailed journalists and outlawed protests? The African Union held an emergency session. Some members demanded immediate sanctions, but something had changed in the room. Representatives from Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger stood and walked out. They weren't interested in restoring a puppet government. They were watching a new Africa being born, and they refused to interrupt it. Burkina Faso's captain Ibrahim Traoré gave a rare televised statement. "What the Togolese people are doing is not illegal, it is moral. What they are dismantling is not order, it is oppression. We do not support coups, we support freedom." The room fell silent, because it wasn't just a message to the AU, it was a challenge to the entire global order. Meanwhile, in Togo, the streets remained filled, not with tanks, but with music, not with tear gas, but with dance. The world had expected violence. What they witnessed instead was a people who knew exactly what they were doing, and a new generation who refused to be told they couldn't. They were not begging for the world's approval. They were showing it how freedom is taken back when no one gives it. Faure Gnassingbé, once the face of power in Togo, now sat in a cold, windowless military courtroom. No red carpets, no motorcades, no carefully scripted speeches, only silence and the eyes of a nation. The courtroom was packed. Military officers, survivors of past repression, journalists, mothers of disappeared sons. Outside, thousands stood in the sun, listening to loudspeakers, waiting to hear the voice of the man who ruled them for 19 years. And what he would say now that the power was no longer his. The charges were read aloud: corruption, election fraud, state-sponsored violence, misuse of public funds, complicity in torture. When the final charge echoed through the room, a woman in the front row whispered, "That's my brother's case." Faure didn't flinch. He wore a simple white shirt, no tie, no medals, just silence. Then the first witness took the stand. A former minister, a man who once shook hands with diplomats, signed trade deals, smiled for cameras. Now his hands trembled as he testified. He spoke of bribes paid to foreign companies, millions siphoned from hospitals, schools, roads. He admitted to delivering envelopes of cash to fake NGOs, only to see them end up in Parisian bank accounts. And then he looked at Faure and said, "I did it for you, but I did it out of fear, not loyalty." The room was silent. Then came the mother of a university student who was killed during protests. She held up her son's blood-stained notebook. "This is what he died for," she said. "Not for hatred, not for revenge, but so that one day you would sit where you are now and be judged." Faure's eyes lowered. For the first time, his hands clenched. The court gave him the chance to speak. He stood slowly, cleared his throat and said, "You think you understand power. You don't. Power is not what you hold. It is what holds you." There were no tears, no apology, just an empty defense from a man who thought the presidency was his inheritance. The military judge adjourned the session, but outside, the crowd already knew the verdict. History had already spoken, and for the first time in living memory, the people believed in justice. Not from the system they were born into, but from the courage they had finally claimed. This wasn't just a trial, it was a reckoning, and it wasn't over yet. The fall of Faure Gnassingbé did not sit well in Paris. For decades, Togo had been a quiet client state, reliable, obedient, and profitable. Under Faure's watch, French multinationals secured mining rights, military cooperation, and strategic influence in West Africa. So when the news of his arrest reached the Élysée Palace, alarms went off. Not for democracy, but for interests. Behind closed doors, French intelligence officials met in emergency session. The verdict was swift. We must extract Faure. If he speaks, if he confesses, we risk losing the entire region. A covert operation was authorized within 48 hours. Under the codename Operation Eclipse, a French Special Forces team was deployed, trained, armed, and airborne. Their objective: infiltrate Togo under humanitarian cover, reach the detention facility, and extract Faure to a safe location in Benin. They underestimated the new Togo. Colonel Kwame Agbeome, now head of the Transitional Military Council, received word from an informant inside the French embassy. Satellite imagery had detected the unauthorized flight path. Encrypted communications confirmed the coordinates. The message was simple: they're coming. Agbeome wasted no time. He activated Protocol Zero, a defensive measure designed in secret with support from Burkina Faso's intelligence unit. Roadblocks were deployed, air defense systems activated, and an elite Togolese commando unit was stationed at the detention facility. At 3:17 a.m., a foreign helicopter breached Togolese airspace under low radar. At 3:24 a.m., it was intercepted and forced to land. On board, 6 operatives, weapons, and false medical IDs. The lead officer tried to claim diplomatic status. He was calmly told, "This is not 1960, and this is not your colony." The operatives were detained and interrogated. The footage leaked within hours. France denied everything, but the evidence was overwhelming and damning. Across Africa, outrage spread like wildfire. In Mali, a public statement was broadcast. "This is why we left ECOWAS. This is why we reject dependency, because even in our rebirth, they come to steal our right to justice." In Ouagadougou, Captain Ibrahim Traoré addressed the incident on national television. "They tried to steal Togo's dignity in the dark. They failed, and next time, they won't leave." It was no longer just about Faure. It was about the future of African sovereignty. Togo had exposed not just a dictator, but a system, and the message to France was no longer whispered. It was loud, clear, and continental. "We are not yours to manage. We are not yours to rescue. We are not yours at all." Colonel Kwame Agbeome stood at the podium in front of the National Assembly, not in full military gear, but in a simple dark suit. No medals, no rank insignia, no promises of eternal rule. He looked exhausted, but the crowd gathered before him saw something different. They saw a man who had risked everything to break a dynasty and refused to replace it with another. The speech was short. "I will not take power. Togo belongs to no man, not me, not the Gnassingbés, not the military. It belongs to the people." A wave of stunned silence swept through the crowd. Some wept. Others clapped slowly, uncertain whether to believe him. In a continent where soldiers often take power only to become the next strongman, Agbayome was breaking the script. Instead of a presidency, he announced the formation of a transitional council for national rebirth, a diverse body of civilians, military officials, and representatives from youth and women's movements. Its mandate was clear: organize free and fair elections within 6 months, rewrite the constitution to ban dynastic rule and lifetime presidencies, investigate crimes of the former regime through an independent commission, and for the first time in Togo's history, broadcast every council session live to the public power would no longer be hidden behind palace walls. The announcement triggered something rare, cautious hope. In the capital, murals of fallen protesters were painted over with new images: youth planting trees, women holding the national flag, artists reimagining a Togo no longer under shadows. The universities reopened. Political exiles began to return. Poets, musicians, and journalists who had fled for years crossed the border back home to a changed country. The streets no longer whispered, they sang. International observers arrived, but this time not as referees of a staged election. They came as witnesses to a people finally allowed to speak. The African Union, under pressure from the Sahel Coalition, welcomed the transition. Even ECOWAS, long accused of siding with incumbents, issued a rare message of support. Togo has chosen the path of dignity. We must now choose to walk with them. And in a small village outside Sokode, an old man looked into the camera of a visiting journalist and said, "I never thought I'd see the day when Togo would be free. I only wish my father had lived to see it." The journalist asked, "What changed everything?" He smiled and replied, "Someone said no, and meant it."